It is becoming tougher and tougher to hide the inflation, stagflation, and shrinkflation in the European Union. So Stagflate tax lie is getting even more difficult for European leaders as politicians, bureaucrats, and central bankers at the European Central Bank to hide the amount of stagflation and shrinkflation in their real economy. So the data that we've seen in the last couple weeks, it showed enormous increases in energy costs for German manufacturers. German manufacturers are also getting hit with much higher input costs. Some of these input costs are up 15% for energy costs and some other input costs for the manufacturers. And on top of this, there's also still supply shortages. And some of these supply shortages are actually getting worse. So here we are 18 plus months into the pandemic, and the supply chain problems, these supply shortages that were supposed to have been fixed within 4 months or 6 months, many of them have actually gotten worse. And you can see that in the data. Now, the European inflation numbers are only seeing a 3% increase in inflation or 4% increase in inflation, depending upon what you're looking at. So obviously, those are divorced from reality. And the governments and PhD economists are still using these adjustments and weightings. So if there is a 15% increase or more in input costs and energy costs and others, they change the weighting, they substitute things out, they figure out ways to reduce the amount of real inflation that the government economic data shows. However, we're seeing actual warnings from a former European leader, the former Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Monti. He just said that stagflation is going to be the biggest threat to Europe's economy. So we are seeing, similar to Alan Greenspan, who for the last couple years before the pandemic was warning that stagflation here in the US would get worse. We're seeing similar warnings now from the former Italian Prime Minister Mario Monti. Now that he's no longer in office, he's warning about stagflation. He's finally speaking at least some truth. And I also put up there inflation expectations for German companies. As you can see there with the chart, the Bloomberg chart, the black one in the upper right-hand part of your screen, it's gone vertical for inflation expectations in 2021. And these cost increases will be passed on to the consumer or other companies in global supply chains through either higher cost of goods sold or shrinkflation or higher prices to the consumer or a combination of these things. And I also put comments from a longtime United Kingdom resident, he's also a patron, talking about all the different excuses that politicians, bureaucrats, PhD economists, investment bankers in the United Kingdom are using to try to explain away the inflation, to try to explain away the stagflation, to try to explain away the shrinkflation. But it's not temporary. If it was temporary, we wouldn't still be discussing this for the last 18 or so months. And I've been warning about this for even longer, but it's just accelerated and gotten worse. So stagflate tax lie is in a global bull market. In some countries or areas, it is worse than others. And in some consumer products, it is worse than others. But unfortunately, there are way more new currency and credit units chasing the same or fewer goods and services in most supply chains. And there's still supply chain problems. In fact, in a lot of supply chains, the problems have not gotten better. They've actually gotten worse over the last 18 months. So yes, some supply chains have improved since the pandemic started 18 plus months ago, but in others, the supply chains have not gotten better, they've actually gotten worse. And now a lot of these manufacturers are dealing with much higher cost of goods sold. You have politicians and bureaucrats and unions in different industries talking about raising wages. So all these factors are going to force cost of goods sold higher, pushed into global supply chains, cost push inflation or stagflation, and they will create higher cost of goods sold, and that will hurt consumers. There will be less purchasing power for the average everyday consumer who spends more of their income to survive. On top of the asset price inflation, the Cantillon effect, and the wealth disparity that these central bankers have also created, especially here in the US, in stocks, bonds, real estate, and all these other speculative vehicles that are going absolutely bonkers like Ether Rock and other NFTs. So if you want to read more about stagflation in Germany and how they're having difficulty hiding the inflation, I'll attach 3 articles below the video in the information and description section. Finally, if you like content like this and want to help keep content like this free so it doesn't all end up behind a paywall, or you want far more in-depth content research, financial education, and analysis than I provide in these short little free videos, there are 28 new articles out in the last 12 or so weeks behind the paywall exclusively for patrons, all for the cost of a Starbucks cup of coffee per month. That's only $5 a month. No one in the space charges less than me for premium content. I think it is one of the best deals out there, and there's over 180 articles, charts, and audio podcasts behind the paywall on a lot of interesting topics about global macro companies and sectors, a lot of in-depth articles on gold mining companies and which ones are controlling their costs, which gold stocks are increasing their dividends lately, despite the US dollar gold price being manipulated while the gold price in other currencies is breaking out. So despite the paper price manipulation and gold price, there are actually a good amount of gold stocks that are growing their dividends very, very nicely. You're being paid to wait. And if you want to read more about that, which companies are doing a good job of increasing dividends and controlling their costs, there are a number of articles out in the last 3 or 4 weeks behind the paywall exclusively for patrons. So if I could wrap up this short video very quickly, government economic data in the European Union, in Germany, is having a more and more difficult time hiding the stagflation, hiding the inflation, hiding the cost push inflation, hiding the shrinkflation. More and more people are waking up, more and more people are noticing the normal excuses that politicians, bureaucrats, Wall Street, investment bankers, mainstream money managers that are leveraged bond fund managers gambling with other people's money, claiming that there's no inflation. The normal excuses that worked in the past are no longer working. People see that they're getting squeezed really, really bad with stagflation and shrinkflation, that their paycheck, that their savings is going far, far less than it has in the past. Their standard of living is rapidly declining. And that's because politicians and bureaucrats and central bankers have thrown currency at the problem when the real economy, they're not allowing the real economy to fix itself. They're not allowing the real economy to open again. And they're hurting small businesses and entrepreneurship, which is preventing entrepreneurs from creating new products and services and creating beneficial deflation for consumers, where their purchasing power increases and there's new products and services coming out to help people and improve their standard of living.